Fireside Tailes with Wolfgang, Episode 28. Originally broadcast on GWC Productions YouTube channel, CAPS Media Television Channel 6, KPPQ-LP Ventura at 104.1 FM, and on the KPPQ Podcast Network. Greetings and salutations. I'm Hunter Ackerman, here to read some classic literature for you and my beastly feline companion Wolfgang. So Wolfus, what do you want to hear? So I'm going to read you all a story by Irvin S Cobb. This guy was born in 1876, died 1944. This actual story was published in 1921. Now, what I find remarkable about this particular story is several things. It's just kind of funny and whimsical to begin with. But this story takes place in the exact spot that my dad and I have backpacked through and camped together, which is the Grand Canyon. And this story mentions a couple of places in the Grand Canyon that are absolutely real. None of the geography of this is made up. This kind of reminds me a little bit of a Dan Brown novel. If you know that name, he wrote The Da Vinci Code. He wrote Angels and Demons. There were a few other like historical conspiracy theory fiction kinds of things. You know, back when conspiracy theories were like still cool and not like scary. Oh my God, it's going to overthrow the government. Don't believe this. The Da Vinci Code was, back when conspiracy theories were just silly. What Dan Brown does really, really cool, really well with the Da Vinci Code, Angels and Demons, and several of other of his novels is every single one he paints environments as though he's been there, because he has, and he's taken copious notes. The guy would just like walk around, I suppose, with a notebook, and maybe he would write some of his stories while he was literally in the museum. I don't know. I've never heard him specify in an interview or otherwise. But Dan Brown makes page-turner, pot-boiler, pulp fiction novels painting these brilliant environments where you can just feel like what it was like to be there. To make my second Robin Williams reference unwittingly in a single evening, in Good Will Hunting, he looks at Ben Affleck and says, "Now, you're a very bright and intelligent kid. You've read a lot. But I bet you can't tell me what the Sistine Chapel smells like." If you read a Dan Brown novel, you'll get an entertaining, if somewhat silly, kind of contorted story, but you'll know from turning a few of those pages, at least you'll think you'll know what the Sistine Chapel smells like. Irvin S Cobb does the same thing, in that he has definitely been to the Grand Canyon. He talks about the Bright Angel Trail, that's real. He talks about the Hermit Trail, that is very concisely, specifically real. Irvin Shrewsbury Cobb was an American author, humorist, editor, columnist from Paducah, Kentucky. Moved to New York in 1904. He's probably one of the most interesting authors you've never heard of. He wrote for the New York World, which is Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper. Even if you never heard of that newspaper, I bet you've heard of Pulitzer. And Cobb was the highest paid staff reporter in the United States. He wrote 60 books, more than 60 books, more than 300 short stories. Several of his works were adapted for silent movies. He wrote other movies, including the Jackie Coogan movie. He wrote an early Cary Grant film in 1933, one of his stories was adapted for the film called The Woman Accused. Yeah, young Cary Grant. So with the advent of sound, like more and more stuff happened for him eventually. Cobb acted in 10 motion pictures and hosted the 7th Academy Awards in 1935. Okay, this is a funny one. After the repeal of Prohibition, Frankfurt distilleries recruited him to compile a recipe book just to remind consumers who were out of practice how to mix a good drink. So he published a book of mixed drinks. Okay, this is my favorite detail. In the midst of covering the 1920 Democratic Convention, Cobb received about 1.5% of the votes on the 23rd presidential ballot. Just like people liked him better than either of the candidate, and they just wrote his name in on their ballot. He was an inspiration for H.P. Lovecraft. The Call of Cthulhu, H.P. Lovecraft. That's that guy. Cobb wrote some short stories in the horror genre. Wow, I've already gone way too long just giving this guy a prelude. I'm gonna have to go over my pages of prelude for how interesting this guy is. So, with no further ado, The Hydrophobic Skunk by Irvin S Cobb. The hydrophobic skunk, which resides at the extreme bottom of the Grand Canyon, is the rarest of living creatures, except perhaps for any Southern liberal politician who never asked for a federal office. This skunk is so rare that nobody ever saw him. That is, nobody except a native. I met plenty of tourists who had seen people who had seen one, but never a tourist who had seen one with his own eyes. In addition to being rare, he's highly gifted. I think almost anybody will agree with me that the common ordinary skunk has been most richly dowered by nature. To adorn a skunk with any extra qualifications seems as a great waste of the raw material as painting the lily or gilding refined gold. He's already amply equipped for outdoor pursuits. Nobody intentionally shoves him around. Everybody gives him as much room as he seems to need. The skunk commands respect. Nay, more than that, respect and veneration wherever he goes. Joyriders never run him down on purpose, and foot passengers avoid crowding him into a corner. You would think nature had done amply well by the skunk, but no. The hydrophobic skunk comes along and upsets all these calculations. Besides carrying the traveling credentials of an ordinary skunk, he is rabid in the most rabidissimous form. He's not mad just part of the time, like one's relatives by marriage, like one's in-laws. He's not mad most of the time, like the old-fashioned railroad ticket agent, but mad all of the time. Incurably, enthusiastically, and unanimously mad. He is mad, and he is glad of it. We made the acquaintance of the hydrophobic skunk when we rode down the Hermit Trail. The casual visitor to the Grand Canyon, first of all, takes the rim drive. Then he essays Bright Angel Trail, which is sufficiently scary for his purposes until he gets used to it. By the way, I categorically agree. Now, maybe this is after Roosevelt's New Deal, but the Bright Angel Trail is like broad and wide, and yeah, there's like a dramatic drop, but it's like it's not like a vacuum cleaner is pulling you toward it or anything like that. I don't find it scary, but it might have looked different in 1921. I'm not sure. So, the casual visitor to the Grand Canyon essays the Bright Angel Trail, which is sufficiently scary for his purpose until he gets used to it. And after that, he grows more adventurous and tackles the Hermit Trail, which is a marvel of corkscrew convolutions, gimleting its way down the red abdominal wound of a canyon to the very gizzard of the world. Here, Johnny, our guide, felt moved to speech, and we hearkened to his words and hungered for more. For Johnny knows the ranges of the Northwest as a city dweller knows his own little side street. In the fall of the year, Johnny comes down to the Grand Canyon and serves as a guide a while. And then, when he gets so he just can't stand associating with tourists any longer, he packs his war bags and journeys back to the northern range and enjoys the company of cows for a spell. Cows are not exactly exciting, but they don't ask foolish tourist questions. A highly competent young person is Johnny, and a cow puncher of parts. Most of the canyon guides are cow punchers, accomplished ones too, and of high standing in the profession. With a touch of reverence, Johnny pointed out to us Sam Scoville, the greatest bronco buster of his time, now engaged in piloting tourists. "Can he ride?" echoed Johnny in answer to our question. Scoville could ride an earthquake if she stood still long enough for him to mount. He rode steamboat, not young steamboat, but old steamboat. He rode rocking chair, and he's the only man that ever did that and was not called on in a couple of days to attend his own funeral. So, we went on at a lazy mule trot, hearing the unwritten annals of the range from one who had seen them enacted at first hand. Pretty soon, we had passed a herd of burros with dusty noses and spotty hides, feeding on prickly pears and rock lichens, and just before sunset, we slid down the last declivity out upon the plateau and came to a camp. And this was a camp. Side note, this camp that they were referring to does not exist any longer, but I do know the plateau that they're referring to where it was located. In fact, there are still building foundations down there you can see the ruins and remains of. This was roughing it deluxe, with a most deluxe-y vengeance. Here were 3 tents, or rather 3 canvas houses with wooden half walls, and they were spick and span inside and out, had glass windows in them and doors and matched wooden floors. The mess tent was provided with a table with a clean cloth to go over it, and there were china dishes and china cups and shiny knives, forks, spoons. Bill was in charge of the camp. A dark, rangy, good-looking leading man of a cowboy wearing his blue shirt and his red neckerchief with an air. That Johnny certainly could cook. Served on china dishes upon a cloth-covered table, we had mounds of fried steaks and shoals of fried bacon and a bushel, more or less, of shepherdess potatoes and green peas and sliced peaches out of cans and sourdough biscuits as light as kisses and much more filling, and fresh butter and fresh milk and coffee as black as your hat and strong as sin. How easy it is for civilized man to become primitive and comfortable in his way of eating, especially if he's just ridden 10 miles on a buckboard and 9 more on a mule and is away down at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and there's nobody to look on disapprovingly when he takes a bite that would be credit to a steam shovel. Hunter's note on this point: I've done that hike without aid of a burro or a mule, and while carrying a heavy backpack, probably 40 or 50 pounds, and to this day, one of the memorable best meals of my life was at the bottom of the Bright Angel Trail. Dad and I had put in on the east side of the canyon, hiked across to come out the Bright Angel Trail on the west side. And I think after 4 days, we came to the camp at the bottom of the Bright Angel Trail called Phantom Ranch. There, I had one of the most incredible steaks of my entire life, because it was the first real non-dehydrated meal that I had had in all that time of carrying a big heavy load through a very difficult, challenging ecosystem. So, despite all reports to the contrary, I wish to state that it is no trouble at all to eat green peas off a knife blade. You merely mix them with potatoes for a cement, mix it with fried steak, take it from an old steak eater. Tastes best when eaten with those tools of nature's own providing, both your hands and your teeth. An hour passed, busy yet pleasant, and we were both gorged to the gills and had reared back with our cigarettes lit to enjoy a third jorum of black coffee apiece, when Johnny, speaking in an offhand way to Bill, who was still hiding away biscuits inside of himself like a parlor prestidigitator, said, "So, you seen any of them old hydrophobies in the last day or two?"
Nah, not so many,"
said Bill casually.
"There was a couple out last night perooting around in the moonlight. I reckon, though, there'll be quite a flock of them out tonight. New moon always seems to fetch 'em up fresh from the river."
Both of us quit blowing on our coffee, and we put the cups down. I think I was the one who spoke. "I beg your pardon?" I asked. "But, what did you say would be out tonight?"
"Oh, we was just speaking to one another about them hydrophobic skunks,"
said Bill, apologetically.
"This here canyon is where they mostly hang out and frolic around."
I laid down my cigar, too. I admit, I was interested. "Oh," I said softly, like that. "Is it? Do they?" "Go on." "Yeah," said Johnny. "I reckon there's liable to be one come shoving his old nose into that door in a minute. Or probably two that most of the travels in pairs. Sets, as you might say."
"And you'd know the minute you saw them, though," said Bill. "They're smaller than a regular skunk and spotted where the other kind of stripy, and they got little red eyes. You won't have no trouble at all recognizing one."
It was at this juncture that we both got up and moved back by the stove. It was warmer there, and the chill of the evening seemed to be settling down noticeably. "Funny thing about hydrophobic skunks," went on Johnny after a moment of pensive thought. "They're mad, you know." "What makes them mad?" The two of us asked the question together.
"Oh, they're just born that way,"
explained Bill.
"Mad from the start and won't never do nothing to get it shut off of it."
They They never attack humans, I suppose. "Don't they?" said Johnny, as if surprised at such ignorance. "Why, humans is their favorite pastime. Humans is just pie to a hydrophobic skunk.
It ain't really any fun to be bit by a hydrophobic skunk, neither. He raised his cup of coffee to his lips and imbibed deeply. Which, you certainly said something then, Johnny, said Bill. You see, he went on, turning to us, they aim to catch you asleep. And they creep up right soft and take hold to you. They take hold to your ear, usually. They clamp their teeth, and they just hang on for further orders. Some say they hang on till thunders, same as snapping turtles do. But that's a lie, I judge, because there's weeks on a stretch down here when it won't thunder. All the cases I ever heard of, they usually let go at sunup. And it's right painful at the time, said Johnny, taking up the thread of the narrative. And then, in 9 days, you go mad yourself. Remember that fella the hydrophobic skunk bit down here by the rapids, Bill? Let's see now, what was that hombre's name? Williams, supplied Bill. Heck, Williams. I saw him at Flagstaff when they took him there to the hospital. That guy certainly did carry on regardless. First he went mad and his eyes turned red. Then, he got so he didn't have no real use for water. Well, them prospectors don't never care much about water anyway, and then he got weird. Then he got snapping and biting and foaming, so they had to strap him down to his bed. He got loose, though. Broke loose, I suppose? I said. No. He bit loose, said Bill, with an air of one who would not deceive you even in a matter of small details. Do you mean to say he bit those leather straps in two? No, sir. He couldn't reach them, explained Bill. So he bit the bed in two. I mean, not in one bite, of course. He went on. Took him several. I saw him after he was laid out. He really wasn't no credit to himself as a corpse. I'm not sure, but I think my companion and I were holding hands by now. Outside, we could hear that little lost echo laughing to itself. There's no time to be laughing, either. Under certain circumstances, I don't know of a lonelier place anywhere on Earth than that Grand Canyon. Presently, my friend spoke, and it seemed to me his voice was a mite husky. I mean, he had a bad cold. You said they were mostly attacked persons who are sleeping outside, didn't you? Yeah, that's right, too, said Johnny. And Bill nodded in affirmation. Then, of course, since we sleep indoors, everything will be just fine, I put in. Well, yes and no, answered Johnny. In the early part of the evening, a hydrophobia is liable to do a lot of prowling around outdoors. But toward morning, they like to get into camps. They dig up onto the sidewalls. Maybe they come up through the floor. And they seem to prefer to get in bed with you. They're cold-blooded, I reckon. Same as rattlesnakes. Cool nights always do drive 'em in, seems like. Yeah, it's gonna be sort of coolish tonight, said Bill. Casually. And it certainly was. I don't remember a chillier night in years. My teeth were chattering just a little from the cold before we turned in. I retired with all my clothes on, including my boots, my leggings, and I wished I had brought along my earmuffs. I also buttoned my watch into my left-hand shirt pocket, the idea being if for any reason I should conclude to move during the night, I'd be fully equipped for traveling. The door would not stay closely shut. The jam had sagged a little and the wind kept blowing the door ajar. But after a while, we dozed off. It was 1:27 a.m. when I woke with a violent start. I know this was the exact time because that was when my watch stopped. I peered about me in the darkness. The door was wide open. Down on the floor, there was a dragging, scuffling sound. And from almost beneath me, a pair of small red eyes peered up phosphorescently. "It's here!" I said to my companion as I emerged from my blankets, and he, waking instantly, seemed instinctively to know whom I meant. I used to wonder at the ease with which a cockroach can climb a perfectly smooth wall and run across the ceiling. I know now that to do this is the easiest thing in the world if you have the proper incentive behind you. I had gone up one wall of the tent and had crossed over and was in the act of coming down the other side when Bill burst in, his eyes blurred with sleep, a lighted lamp in one hand and a gun in the other. I was never so disappointed in my life because it wasn't a hydrophobic skunk at all. It was a pack rat, sometimes called a trade rat, paying us a visit. The pack rat, or trade rat, is also a denizen of the Grand Canyon. He's about 4 times as big as an ordinary rat and has an appetite to correspond. He sometimes invades your camp and makes free with your things, but he never steals anything outright. He merely trades with you, hence his name. He totes off a side of meat or a bushel of meal and brings a cactus stalk in. Or he'll confiscate your saddlebags and leave you in exchange a nice dry chip. He's honest, but from what I can gather, he never gets badly struck on a deal. The next morning at breakfast, Johnny and Bill were doing a lot of laughing between them over something or other. Yeah. My mom's editing note, these were dudes on a snipe hunt. Yes, indeed. So I'm just now glancing up in the chat the suggestion of maybe we can convince him to do an earlier special kids edition sometime. Yeah, Trade Rat would be a cool band name indeed. Okay, so I think I'm going to save this Stephen Crane story for next week because it's a bit longer. It's going to take longer to read than I was planning on going tonight. However, I kind of want to go back. I want to do some more justice to this character, this Irvin S Cobb guy. Because this guy is just, the guy that wrote this story, he's just really captured my imagination. This guy is just a fascinating dude. So I mentioned before reading that story that this guy was an inspiration of H.P. Lovecraft. Again, to reiterate, Lovecraft wrote The Call of Cthulhu, the big cuttlefish-faced monster, the big octopus. Oh, Jesus! All of a sudden, all the cephalopods are just escaping my pronunciation. Yeah, Cthulhu is an elder god who lives under the sea and comes from either the outskirts of the solar system or beyond. It's never really clarified.
H.P. Lovecraft did some things in fiction. He virtually invented horror sci-fi. He was writing a lot of his stuff in the 1930s and setting a lot of his stuff in the late 1800s in a fictitious town in New England. But the relevance of all of this is that Cobb also wrote short stories in the horror genre, such as one in 1911 called Fishhead, one in 1923 called The Unbroken Chain. Fishhead has been cited as an inspiration for H.P. Lovecraft's The Shadow over Innsmouth, which I've considered reading on this show several times, while The Unbroken Chain was a model for Lovecraft's The Rats in the Walls. The former was described by Lovecraft as banefully effective in its portrayal of unnatural affinities between a hybrid idiot and the strange fish of an isolated lake. All of this was published in an essay called Supernatural Horror in Literature. Cobb wrote a letter detailing his desired funeral arrangements. I'm going to read part of that letter to you here. I'm going to remind you, this is the guy that covered the 36th presidential election, or as a staff writer, as a reporter, and he ended up getting something like 1.5% of the votes himself because he was just that charismatic by comparison to the actual candidates. He just wasn't even running. He got that on a write-in. So, Cobb wrote a letter detailing his desired funeral arrangements. Here's part of the document, at least. Above all, I want no long faces and no show of grief at the burying ground. Kindly observe the final wishes of the undersigned and avoid reading the so-called Christian burial service, which, in view of the language employed in it, I regard as one of the most cruel and paganish things inherited by our forebears from our remote pagan ancestors. In deference to the faith of our dear mother, who was through her lifetime a loyal, though never bigoted communicant of that congregation, perhaps the current pastor of the First Presbyterian Church would consent to read the 23rd Psalm, which was her favorite passage in the Scriptures, and is mine, since it contains no charnel words, no morbid mouthings about corruption and decay, and, being mercifully without creed or dogma, carries no threat of eternal hellfire for those parties we do not like, nor direct promise of a heaven, which, if one may judge by the people who are surest of going there, must be a powerfully dull place, populated to a considerable and uncomfortable degree by prigs, time servers, and unpleasantly aggressive individuals. Hell may have a worse climate, but undoubtedly the company is sprightlier. The Catholics, with their genius for stage management, handle this detail better. The officiating clergyman speaks in Latin, and the parishioners, being unacquainted with that language, are impressed by the majesty of the rolling, sonorous periods without being shocked by distressing allusions and harrowing references. I love his take on I love his take on different branches of Christianity that in Catholic dogma there was a place they just referred to as limbo for a time, and this Cobb refers to, I'm sure, is what he was referring to. The Catholics, with their genius for stage management, handle this detail better. It's
This is a story by Mark Twain. And as much of Mark Twain's stories as we think of as taking place in the heartland and steamboats in the Mississippi River, this one actually takes place in California, just a few hours north of here. This is called The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County by Mark Twain. In compliance with the request of a friend of mine who wrote me from the East, I called on good-natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler and inquired after my friend's friend, Leonidas W. Smiley, as requested to do. And I hereunto append the result. I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that, if I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of his infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me nearly to death with some infernal reminiscence of him as long and tedious as it should be completely useless to me. If that was the design, it certainly succeeded. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably by in the bar-room stove of the old dilapidated tavern in the ancient mining camp of Angels. And I noticed that he was fat and bald-headed and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. He roused up and gave me good day. I told him a friend of mine had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood named Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel, who he had heard was at one time a resident of Angels Camp. And by the way, Californians east of San Francisco might know Angels Camp. It's a small town. It's really there. It's still there. I added that if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about this Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, I would feel under many obligations to him. Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner, blockaded me there with his chair, then sat me down and reeled off the monotonous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never smiled. He never frowned. He never changed his voice from the gentle, flowing key to which he tuned the initial sentence. He never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm, but all through the interminable narrative there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity, which showed me plainly that, so far from his imagining that there was anything ridiculous or funny about his story, he regarded it as a really important matter and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius in finesse. To me, the spectacle of a man drifting serenely along through such a queer yarn without ever smiling was exquisitely absurd. As I have said before, I asked him to tell me what he knew of Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and he replied as follows. I let him go on in his own way and never interrupted him once. There was a fella here once by the name of Jim Smiley in the winter of 49. Maybe it was the spring of 50, I don't recollect exactly. Somehow, though, what makes me think it was one or the other is because I remember the big flume wasn't finished when he first came to the camp. But anyway, he was a curious man, about always betting on anything that turned up you ever see. If you could get anybody to bet anything on the other side, and if he couldn't, he'd change sides. Anyway, that just suited the other man, would suit him anyway. Just so long as he's got a bet, he was satisfied. But still, he was lucky. Uncommonly lucky. He most always come out winner. He was always ready and laying for a chance. There couldn't be no solitary thing mentioned that feller had offered a bet on it. And take any side as you please. As I was just telling you, if there was a horse race, you'd find him flush. Or you'd find him busted at the end of it. If there was a dog fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he'd bet on it. Why, if there was two birds sitting on a fence, he would bet you which one would fly first. Or if there was a camp meeting, he would be there regular to bet on Parson Walker, which he judged to be the best exhorter about here. And so he was, too. And a good man. If he was ever seen a straddlebug start to go anywhere, you would bet you how long you'd take him to get wherever he was going to go. And if you took him up, he would follow that straddlebug to Mexico. But what he would find out where he was bound for and how long he was still on the road, still lots of boys here, they've seen that Smiley, and they could tell you that about him. Why, it never made no difference to him. He would bet on anything, the damnedest feller. Parson Walker's wife laid real sickly once, and for a good while. And it seemed like they weren't going to be able to save her. One morning he comes in, Smiley asked her how she was, and he said she was considerable better, thank the Lord for his infinite mercy and coming on so smart as that with the blessing of providence. She'd get well yet. And Smiley, before he thought, says, well, I'll risk 2.5 that she don't, anyway. This year Smiley had a mare. The boys called her the 15-minute nag, but that was only in fun. You know, because, of course, she was faster than that, and he used to win money on that horse. For all she was so slow and always had the asthma or the distemper or the consumption or something of that kind. They used to give her 200 or 300 yard start, then pass her underway, but always at the fag end of the race, she'd get excited and desperate, and come cavorting and straddling up and scattering her legs around the limber, sometimes in the air, sometimes out to the side amongst the fences, and kicking them up more dust and raising more racket with her coughing and her sneezing and blowing her nose, and always fetch up at the stand just about a neck ahead as far as you could cipher it down. And he had a little small bull pup that took to him like you'd think he one's worth a man's scent, but sat around and look ornery and lay for a chance to steal something. But as soon as money was up on him, he was a different dog. His underjaw would begin to stick out like the forecastle of a steamboat, and his teeth would uncover and shine savage like the furnaces. And a dog might tackle him and bullyrag him and bite him and throw him over his shoulder 2 or 3 times. And Andrew Jackson, which was the name of the pup, Andrew Jackson, by the way, would never let on but till he was satisfied and hadn't expected nothing else. And the bets being doubled and doubled on the other side all the time till the money was all up. Then, all of a sudden, he'd grab that other dog just by the joint of his hind leg and freeze on it. Not chew, you understand, but only just grip it and hang on till they thronged up the sponge if it was a year. Smiley always come out winner on that pup, till he harnessed a dog once that didn't have no hind legs, 'cause they'd been sawed off by a circular saw. And when the thing had gone along far enough and the money was all up and he come to make a snatch for his pet hold, he saw in a minute how he'd been imposed upon and how the other dog had him in the door, so to speak. And he appeared surprised. And then he looked sort of discouraged like. And he didn't try no more to win the fight. And so he got shucked out bad. He gave Smiley a look as much as to say his heart was broke and that it was his fault for putting up a dog that had no hind leg for him to take a hold of, which was his main dependence in a fight. Then he limped off a piece and laid down and died. He was a good pup, that Andrew Jackson. Would have made a name for himself if he had lived, for the stuff was in him. And he had genius. I know it, because he had no opportunities to speak of, and it don't stand to reason that a dog could make such a fight as he could under them circumstances if he had no talent. It was always made me feel sorry when I think of that last fight of his and the way it turned out. Such a shame. Well, this here Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats and all them kinds of things that you couldn't resist. And you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on, but he'd match you. He catched a frog one day and took him home and said he calculated to educate him. And so, he ain't never done nothing for 3 months but sit back in his yard and learn that frog to jump. And you betcha he did learn him too. He'd give him a little punch behind, and the next minute, you'd see that frog whirl in the air like a donut. See him turn one somersault, maybe a couple if he got a good start. And he'd come down flat-footed all right, like a cat. Got him so up in the matter of catching flies, kept him in practice so constant that he'd nail a fly every time as far as we could see him. Smiley said all the frog wanted was education. And he could do most anything, and I believe him. Why? I've seen him set Daniel Webster down here on this floor. Daniel Webster was the name of the frog. And sing out, "Flies, Daniel, flies." And quicker than you could wink, he'd spring straight up, snake a fly off on the counter there, and flop down on the floor again, solid as a gob of mud, and fall to scratching the side of his head with his hind foot as indifferent as if he had no idea he'd been doing any more than any frog might do. You never seen a frog so modest and straightforward as he was. For all he was so gifted. And when it come to fair and square jumping on a dead level, he'd get over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever did see. Jumping on a dead level, that was his strong suit, you understand. And when it come to that, Smiley would ante up money on him as long as he had a red cent. Smiley was monstrous proud of that frog, as well as he might be, for fellers that had traveled and been everywheres, and all said he laid over any frog that they ever did see. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a little lattice box. You're the beast. And he used to fetch him downtown sometimes and lay for a bit. One day, a stranger in the camp, he was come across him with his box and says, "What might that be you got there in that yonder box?" Smiley says, sort of indifferent like, "It might be a parrot, or it might be a canary, maybe, but it ain't. It's only just a frog." And the feller took it, looked at it careful, turned around this way and that and says, "Oh, so 'tis. Well, what's it good for?" "Well," says Smiley, easy and careless, "he's good enough for one thing. I should judge he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the box again and another long, particular look. Gave it back to Smiley and says very deliberate, "Well, I don't see no points about that frog that's any better than any other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley says. "Maybe you understand frogs, and maybe you don't understand them. Maybe you had experience, and maybe you ain't only an amateur, as it were. Anyway, I've got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 that he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." The fella studied a minute, and then says, kinda sad like, "Well, I'm only a stranger here, and I ain't got no frog. But if I had a frog, I'd bet you." And then Smiley says, "Well, that's all right, that's all right. You get a hold of my box a minute, I'll go and get you a frog." So the feller took the box, put up his $40 along with Smiley's, and sit down to wait. So he sit there a good while, thinking to himself, and he got the frog out, and he pried his mouth open and took a teaspoon and filled him full of quail shot. That's little lead BBs, if you don't know what that term means. Filled him put near up to his chin, set him on the floor. Smiley, he went down to the swamp. He slopped around in the mud for a long time. Finally, he catched himself a frog, fetched him in, gives him to this feller, and says, "Now, if you were ready, set him alongside of Daniel with his forepaws, just even with Daniel, and I'll give the word." Then he says, "1, 2, 3, jump." And him and the feller touched the frogs from behind, and the new frog hopped off. But Daniel didn't give a heave and hissed up his shoulders like a Frenchman. But it wasn't no use. He wouldn't budge. He had planted as solid as an anvil, and he couldn't do more than stir than if he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised. And he was disgusted too, but he didn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The feller took the money and started away. And when he was going out the door, he sort of jerked his thumb over his shoulders this way at Daniel and says again, very deliberate, "Well, I don't see no points about that frog that's any better than any other frog." Smiley stood scratching his head, looking down at Daniel for a long time. At last he says, "I do wonder what in the nation throwed that frog off. Wonder if there ain't something matter with him. He appears to look mighty baggy somehow." And he catched Daniel by the nape of the neck and lifted him up and says, "Why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pounds. And he turned him upside down and belched out a double handful of shot. Then he sees how it was, and he was the maddest man. He set the frog down, took off after that feller, but he never catched him. And here, Simon Wheeler heard his name called from the front yard, got up to see what was wanted. Turning to me, as he moved away, he said, "Just you sit where you are, stranger. Rest ain't easy, but I ain't gonna be gone a second." But by your leave, I did not think that a continuation of the history of the enterprising vagabond Jim Smiley would be likely to afford me much information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley. And so I started away. At the door, I met the sociable Wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me, and recommenced. Well, this here Smiley, he had a yellow one-eyed cow that didn't have no tail, only just a short stump like a banana, and... Okay. Hang Smiley and his afflicted cow, I muttered good-naturedly, and bidding the old gentleman good day, I departed.
This is a poem by Kahlil Gibran called Fear. It is said that before entering the sea, a river trembles with fear. She looks back at the path she has traveled from the peaks of the mountains, the long winding road crossing forests and villages, and in front of her, she sees an ocean so vast that to enter, there seems nothing more than to disappear forever. But there is no other way. The river cannot go back. Nobody can go back. To go back is impossible in existence. The river needs to take the risk of entering the ocean because that's where the river will know. It's not about disappearing into the ocean, but of becoming the ocean. Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Kahlil. It reminds me of a quote I came across in my high school modern fiction class. I don't know who this quote is attributed to, or if it's even known. Maybe it's anonymous. Just very simply states, you can't go home again. When I was a teenager, it took me a little while to wrestle with that because I had only teenage experiences to measure it against. But looking back at the backdrop of what I already considered to be some nostalgic preschool memories and childhood camping trips, like, yeah, you can't recreate some of that stuff. This poem is called Let These Be Your Desires by Kahlil Gibran. Love has no other desire but to fulfill itself. But if your love must needs have desires, let these be your desires. To melt and be like a running brook that sings its melody to the night. To know the pain of too much tenderness. To be wounded by your own understanding of love and to bleed willingly and joyfully. To wake at dawn with a winged heart and give thanks for another day of loving. To rest at the noon hour and meditate love's ecstasy. To return home at eventide with gratitude. And then to sleep with a prayer for the beloved in your heart and a song of praise upon your lips. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Fireside Tailes with Wolfgang. To view more of my work, check out my YouTube channel at Hunter's Acoustic Cabin. Directed by Hunter Ackerman. Endorsed by Wolfgang Beastly. Produced by GWC Productions. Originally broadcast on GWC Productions' YouTube channel, CAPS Media Television Channel 6, KPPQ LP Ventura at 104.1 FM, and on the KPPQ Podcast Network.